Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andy Restrepo. To start, I'd like to show you a quick picture to get your attention. And it says, marriage is a relationship in which one person is always right and the other is the husband. So, how many of us are married in this room? Okay, so about half of the room, okay? And the other half are probably too young and still live in the barracks, right? All right. So, another thing I wanted to share with you is this quick joke, just to kind of break the ice a little bit. A police officer jumps into his squad car and calls the station. I have an interesting case here, he says. A woman shot her husband for stepping on the floor she just mopped. Have you arrested her? Asked the sergeant. No, not yet. The floor's still wet. All right. So, my topic of discussion today is going to be the evolution of marriage. Okay. During my research, I found that back in the medieval ages, people got married for different reasons, and it was further from what you might be imagining. It had nothing to do with love. It had nothing to do with how you felt about that person. It was more so about an economical convenience. So if you were a baker, you were probably going to end up married to a baker. If you were a cattle driver, you were probably going to end up marrying someone who could help you drive that cattle. And when you had your children, that was free labor in the process. Okay. Nowadays, it's a little bit different. Okay. Some of the research that I did, I found on the website TED. Have any of you heard of TED Talks? Okay, so TED is Technology, Education, and Design. And so during the research, there was a talk by a lady named Jenna McCarthy, and one of the things that she says is that 50% of divorce ends in, 50% of marriage ends in divorce. Now that's pretty alarming because that basically tells me that half of marriages are going to end up failing, and that's pretty alarming nowadays. And I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so some of the things I'm going to discuss today are going to be the how marriage evolved in the last 50 years, how it is today, and the potential of marriage for the future. Okay. So for starters, I'll discuss how marriage was in the past 50 years. We're talking about the 1960s. 1967, there was a very visible Supreme Court case, which was Loving versus the state of Virginia. And that was the first interracial marriage that went to the Supreme Court. That case was an African-American woman marrying a white male. And they were married in the state of, in District of Columbia. But they lived in Virginia, and that state had outlawed marriage. So we've come a long way from that to where we are today. But that kind of set the course for a lot of things. Also, in 1967, the median age to get married was about 23 years old for men and 20 for women. So people were getting married a lot younger. And the reason for that is because there was this belief that marriage was going to be forever. They had no reason to think otherwise. They saw their parents, they would get married after maybe only 6 months of courting, and that's just the way it was. You worked out your issues, and that's just, you worked out any differences that you had, whether you had any arguments or whatever the case might have been. So you fast forward to today, things are a little bit different. And again, I'll get to that in a minute. Now, in 1979, divorce rate went up from 400,000 to 1.2 million divorces. And this affected children. Those children grew up to what you see today, where you're looking at people who don't really believe in the institution of marriage. And the reason for that is because they grew up where they're seeing their parents arguing and fighting all the time, and they became afraid of the idea of marriage. So it got to the point where they themselves didn't believe in the institution of marriage. They wanted to, not have to deal with the stress of going through a divorce, dealing with the stress of being in arguments with their spouse all the time. Okay. Another thing, in 1967, the average household was about 3.3 people. Now, I don't really know how you cut a person into 0.3, but that was the statistics per the Census Bureau back then. Okay. And in 2006, the average household was 2.6. Once again, I don't know how you make a person 0.6 of a person, but that's how it was back then. All right. What is that telling us? That's telling us that in the 60s, you were trying to have a large family. It was more of a traditional thing. In present times, it's not, the idea of having a big family is not so much there anymore. Why? You're probably thinking economic reasons. You can't afford to have that many children anymore, okay? Let's see, one of the websites that I looked at, which was Blue Nation Review, first discussed 2004, gay marriage. Now that's a pretty hot topic, even today in 2016, is it not? I think we can all agree with that. Now, for us being in the military, this topic is probably even more of a topic because just up until a couple years ago, gays and lesbians weren't even allowed to serve freely, right? So now we're talking about the institution of marriage in the military as well. Okay, so I've talked about what marriage was like in the past. Now I'm going to talk about what marriage is currently like. So some of the details that I spoke about were the median age for men now, as recently as 2006, the median age for men was 27, I'm sorry, and for women it was 26. So during my research, I was able to find that the reason for this is because the same children who are products of divorce now want to live their life a little bit more before they settle down and commit to someone else. They want to be single. They want to, explore, live their life, travel the world. They want to see what life has to offer before they finally say, you know what, I'm going to make my life with someone else and start a family. In my personal opinion, I think that's a great thing. I personally didn't get married till I can't even remember, but it was about 3 years ago. So I was 29. I was a little bit older, and I did get to explore and, kind of live by that example. Another thing that I learned during my research was a gentleman named Michael McMahons. He talks about divorce and how much divorce affects everyone. So like I mentioned earlier, people don't want to relive what they lived during their childhood. So that's a big reason why they're waiting so much now to get married. Okay. Now during some of the research, I tried to find where's the institution of marriage going into the future, and that kind of left me pondering a lot of different things. I honestly can't tell you where the institution of marriage is going in the next 50 years. There's so many changes within society with racial lines, with sexual orientation, with religious beliefs. The traditional idea of marriage is kind of open to interpretation at this point. And it's going to be kind of hard to see what the idea of marriage is going to be like in 50 years. In my opinion, I think that marriage may become obsolete at some point. And people are finding ways to make do with that. And it's okay. I think society itself is going to accept that a lot more. It's going to be more acceptable for a man and a woman to have a child and not be married. I think it's already very well known, but I think it's just going to become more of a common thing as the years progress. As it is, society is already working on accepting marriage equality between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. And it's just going to become more of a common everyday thing, in my opinion. So today I've talked about where marriage was 50 years ago. I've talked about where marriage currently is, and I've briefly touched on where marriage will be in the future. To conclude, I'd like to leave you with one more funny thing that I found. A woman noticed her husband standing in the bathroom scale, sucking in his stomach. "Ha, that's not going to help," she says. "Sure it does," he said. "It's the only way I can see the numbers." Thank you. Okay. I'll wait for that to sink in. That concludes my speech. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, at this time, I'd like to open the floor for any questions that anyone may have. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that the reason why all the changes in marriages is caused by media?
I think that the media actually absolutely has a lot to do with it. I think that pop culture has a lot to do with it. The inflation of reality TV has a lot to do with it. TV shows like Leave It to Beaver and Andy Griffith Show and those things where, or even I Love Lucy, where they're showing a man and a woman and a very traditional um, environment has changed to where you're seeing a lot different things on TV nowadays. So that's a good question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think is the most important key to marriage to prevent a divorce from happening or a separation?
That's also a really good question. And if I knew the answer to that, I'm sure I'd be a millionaire by now. But to answer that question, I think, in my opinion, it's a lot of hard work. I can speak by my own experience with marriage that it's not easy. Does the benefit outweigh how much work you have to put into it? I think that's everyone individually's opinion. Personally, I think it's a challenge, but it is worth it in the long run, especially when you introduce children to the mix. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Would you say that marriages are failing at such a high rate because they're getting married for the wrong reasons if you compare it to the military, such as people wanting to just move out of the barracks and stuff like that compared to the civilian world?
Absolutely. I think that the reason why people get married nowadays is very different, which I think we're actually kind of heading backwards in a sense because, like I mentioned at the beginning of the speech, initially in the medieval times, people were married for economic reasons, which if you kind of compare it to nowadays, an economic reason is to get out of the barracks, right? So you can collect that housing allowance and now you're kind of doing it for the wrong reason. Not so much because you love that person, but it's like, hey, you want to get out of the barracks? Yeah. Cool, let's go to the courthouse, let's sign some papers, and now we can collect the housing allowance. Now, I even thought about this a couple of years ago, when they introduced same-sex marriages, you can go get married to your best friend, your roommate in the barracks. You don't have to love him, but it's an idea, hey, let's go get married. We don't have to, be in love with each other. We can have the ultimate bachelor pad. That's just another thing that I think about. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Where you said that you believe that it's becoming more socially acceptable for two people to have like a child out of wedlock in today's society.
Yeah.
How do you believe that would affect someone in the military? Like in the upcoming years? Like I know now you have to be married to a person to have your child with you and that person with you in the housing on base. But how would that affect us in the military later on?
Well, I'll just spell that a little bit. You don't necessarily have to be married in order to rate housing. If you have a child, you can have a house on base. It is a little more difficult, but it isn't impossible. So I think that the reason why it's become more socially acceptable is because those same people that I talked about that were products of divorce, they saw what it was like, and they're more accepting of it nowadays. It's more accepting to see a single parent family. And it's more common. It's so common that it has to be accepted. It's not a choice anymore. It's just the way it is. And people make it work. They've made it work for decades now, and there's really no other way around it. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.